Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you are. I'm Alexa Koenig. I'm the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center here at UC Berkeley School of Law. It's my tremendous honor and pleasure to be joined by our three speakers this afternoon, who have really been doing quite critical research at the intersection of human rights, of technology, and the implications of new advances for democracy. As many of you may have seen over the weekend, this weekend was a big one at the intersection of new technologies and human rights, whether reports on the use of remote control of weapons to target and assassinate people by the Israeli government in Iran, or the US government's use of weaponized drones to take out a family of 10 in Afghanistan, a mistaken identity situation. I think we have really seen some of the ways that new technologies are implicating human rights interests around the world. And I think for many of us who are working in the space, really seeing the lack of, or the slow response of law, of politics to really keep up with that very changing landscape. So today, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ronald Niezen, who has written #HumanRights, the technologies and politics of justice claims and practice. Sushma Raman, who has written with a co-author, The Coming Good Society, Why New Realities Demand New Rights. And Stephen Feldstein, The Rise of Digital Repression, How Technology Is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. We're going to go ahead and hear from each of the authors for about 10 minutes about their books and the research that underlies those books. And then I will speak with them for a few minutes where we'll have a moderated conversation and then open it up to all of you to put questions in the chat and put those forward to the authors. We will end at 10 minutes before the hour so that everyone has a time to transition, whether you're joining us in virtual space or may need to get somewhere in physical space for any meetings you may have about 60 minutes from now. So with that, I'd like to introduce our three guest speakers for today. We will hear first from Stephen Feldstein. He is a Berkeley Law alum, so we're especially pleased to re-welcome him to Berkeley Law. He is a senior fellow in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program, where he focuses on issues of democracy, technology, human rights, US foreign policy, and Africa. He previously served as the holder of the Frank and Bethine Church Chair of Public Affairs and as an associate professor at Boise State University. He has also served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau in the US Department of State, where he had responsibility for Africa policy, international labor affairs, and international religious freedom. And before that, he was the Director of Policy at the US Agency for International Development, and also served as counsel on the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. So the next person we will be hearing from is Professor Ronald Niezen, who is a professor of anthropology and an associate member of the Faculty of Law at McGill University. He researches and teaches in the areas of political and legal anthropology, indigenous peoples, and human rights. Professor Niezen has taught legal anthropology and anthropological theory at the Faculty of Law and the Anthropology Department at McGill. He has taught for 9 years at Harvard and held visiting positions at the Department of History at the University of Winnipeg and the Institute for Human Rights at Abo Akademi University in Finland. And last, certainly not least, is Sushma Raman, who is Executive Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard and has so kindly welcomed me a few times now to her center. She has more than 2 decades of experience launching, scaling, and leading social justice and philanthropic programs and collaboratives, building capabilities of grassroots human rights organizations and their leaders, and teaching graduate courses in the public policy schools at UCLA, USC, Tufts Fletcher School, and Harvard Kennedy School. She is the host of the Carr Center's Justice Matters podcast, a contributor to Foreign Policy magazine, and a senior advisor to Walbrook, a global intelligence, due diligence, and risk advisory firm. She has also worked at the Ford Foundation, where she managed a $100 million global program where she helped launch and scale social justice and women's funds around the world, and at the Open Society Foundation, where she was a program officer on the founding staff for US programs, staffing a $50 million fund established to support immigrant and refugee rights. With these introductions, I can never do justice to all the extraordinary work that all three of our guests have done, but now I would love to turn to them to talk a little bit more about the work that they've been doing. So with that, Steve, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Alexa, for the kind introduction and for hosting this discussion. As you mentioned, I am a Berkeley Law alum, and while unfortunately I can't be back on campus to speak to people in person. Hopefully that's something that maybe in the future will be possible. In the meantime, this is good enough, and it does give us an opportunity for people based in various places around the country for our panel to actually talk and discuss these issues. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'll take just a few minutes to kind of walk through some of the main findings and ideas in the book, and then turn it over. So the book, as Alexa mentioned, is about the rise of digital repression around the world. And really the animating, motivating factor for why I wrote the book was to kind of get a better understanding, to identify in a more systematic way digital technology trends and how they link to different political ideas and movements, particularly when it relates to the use of repression by authoritarian leading regimes or autocratic regimes. And so one of the first things I wanted to do in the book was to provide a more consistent definition about what exactly are we talking about when we speak about digital repression or digital authoritarianism. So I begin the book by laying out kind of a definitional framework, and I really divide techniques into 5 categories, which are broad and they're overlapping, but at least help me kind of give logical order and give a sense to how you think about these different tools. So first are techniques that relate to surveillance, and it's everything from mass surveillance techniques such as you would find in China, linked to facial recognition, as well as spyware, so individually targeted software that are specifically intended to penetrate the communications of individuals of interest to the state. Next is censorship tools, and again, this can be mass filtering. This can be things like China's Great Firewall. It could also be more specific website blocking. It could be kind of keyword censorship or filtering based on particular ideas that governments intend or want to suppress. But it's a pretty wide range, and the kind of only sort of common features that it relates to the internet and to online techniques. Third is use of disinformation and social manipulation by governments as a means to manipulate information and content as part of their political strategies. Now, this is a little bit of a new one, because I think a lot of times people think of disinformation in kind of a more diffuse way, or something that different, extreme elements or extreme groups will use in order to subvert the legitimacy of certain political processes like elections. But disinformation techniques actually are a widely used technique that democracies, as liberal democracies and authoritarian governments use as well, as a means to manipulate and change people's understandings of what is true and what is not, as a way to propagate falsehoods and propaganda, as well as a way to intimidate and harass legitimate criticism of governments. And so you see these techniques in places around the world, ranging from India to Turkey to Russia to the Philippines. And in my book, I actually profile in a case study how Duterte in the Philippines, the head of state in the Philippines, has really put together a disinformation machine in lieu of other tactics that has been a primary importance to allow him to stay in power. Fourth is internet shutdowns. So it's breaking connectivity. It's governments either taking down the internet in whole or in part as a way to suppress protests, or sometimes to accompanying armed operations. There's a variety of contexts in which internet shutdowns are used. And finally, there's the persecution against online users. And so it's specific arrests, detentions, jailings of individuals, particularly because of their online influence or the groups they have who are organized online. So you see a lot of examples of this taking place, whether it's the hijacking of planes to take down Belarus opposition members who are running Telegram channels, to the persecution several years back of the Zone 9 bloggers in Ethiopia, or the current trials that Maria Ressa is facing right now in online journalists in the Philippines. But there's kind of a wide ambit there. So I define digital repression, and then I created an index based on data collected by the Digital Society Project, which is linked to the Varieties of Democracy Project, that measures different forms of internet censorship, surveillance, disinformation, so forth. And so what I did was I aggregated this data together and create a global digital repression index that tries to measure around the world within 179 countries relative levels of digital repression. And one of the questions I wanted to understand, kind of based on this statistical analysis, which is kind of part of the book, is to what extent is there a linkage, is there a relationship between the use of these techniques and a country's political system? So in other words, can regime type, authoritarianism, for example, in particular, can that be a predictive factor for whether a country will actually adopt these tools? And so unsurprisingly, what I found was that, in fact, there is a very strong relationship between the two, that the more authoritarian a country is, the more likely it is that they will use a combination of these different tools to advance their political objectives. But I found a couple interesting aspects to this that were surprising. So one of which is that there isn't a uniform approach that authoritarian countries use when it comes to what combination of tools they deploy. So some countries like China, Russia to some extent, Saudi Arabia, others which have a pretty sophisticated set of capabilities, a large resource base, will use a variety of kind of mass surveillance, censorship techniques. But these these are very different than what you would see in other countries which have a much lower capacity base, whether it's a Thailand or a Turkey or a Nigeria. And so one of the kind of insights is that while all authoritarian countries digitally repress, they do so in different ways and in different combinations. And the reasons for why they choose different combinations linked to everything from capacity, financial resources, political traditions, and norms that have been practiced in the country. A second insight I found was that while there is certainly a relationship to authoritarianism, there are a large number of democracies that also rely upon these tools as well to enact their agendas, and that you particularly are seeing a subset of weak or liberal democracies, countries that sort of sit on the dividing line between authoritarianism and democratic rule, places like Turkey, the Philippines, India, to name a few. In those countries, there is a wide prevalence and wide use of these tools. One of the things I found is that in these democracies, the difference that you see between those and autocracies is that they tend to use disinformation strategies in particular as a highly reliant tool to enact their agendas. And the reason they do that is that there is a different tolerance for what publics will accept depending on a country's political system. So what one might accept as a citizen in China when it comes to kind of harder edge repression is very different than what an average Filipino or Kenyan citizen might expect from their governments. And so to that end, it requires governments to innovate and to use different techniques that will be appropriate for the political contexts in which they're in. So I thought that was an important sort of insight in terms of understanding how the variance in the different levels of prevalence when it comes to the use of these digital techniques. In my book, I did field work and case studies for 3 countries, Thailand, Ethiopia, and the Philippines. And I chose these 3 countries because each provides a slightly different approach and understanding for how you think about digital repression. Thailand is more of a classic authoritarian country, one where you have a military establishment together with a monarchy that has reigned over the country for decades. Recently, there's been greater levels of unrest, but that still hasn't done enough to challenge the rule of the incumbents. And so I thought that was really important to kind of look at the Thailand example to sort of see how does a more classically authoritarian system work and what kind of tools do they deploy. The Philippines is sort of very different in that it's a democracy, albeit a poorly run, not well-organized democracy, one that is increasingly liberal under Duterte. And there I had a chance to really examine and understand better how a disinformation strategy and approach can affect politics in a particular country. Finally, Ethiopia was, at least when I visited, was a little bit more in the middle. It was actually undergoing a sort of liberalization moment. We know subsequently that it's now in the midst of a civil war. And so a large amount of the promise that the international community saw in the Prime Minister Abiy, has dissipated. But at the time when I visited, which was last year, February, right before the pandemic struck, there was a moment of hope, and it was a really interesting time for me to go to a number of places, including up in Tigray, where the civil war is now raging, and to actually ask questions about how the prior regime and how prior techniques were being used, what was learned and what was changing, what kind of transformation we were seeing. Sadly, a lot of that has changed, but it still represents, and I think, a fascinating case study. So I don't want to go on too long. I want to just touch on one more point in the book and then turn it over, which is that one of the questions I did ask was, what can we make of the influence of China? Because I think, one of the motivating factors within this book was to better understand what are the drivers of digital repression. Do we look to governments? Do we look to the influence of outside actors? How do we think about that dynamic? And so I asked and really examined questions about China's relative influence throughout my research, particularly in my case studies. And what I found was really eye-opening, in that I expected that there would be much more of a direct linkage between Chinese efforts to propagate their digital model and the take-up of these techniques by different countries. But in fact, I got a lot of pushback, whether talking to government officials, intelligence officers, civil society actors, political opposition, and so forth. A lot of them, first of all, felt that while China's influence was significant in certain ways, many other countries, including the United States and other democracies, also had companies and had influence that was negatively affecting the tech space. And they point to examples of U.S. companies or European companies selling spyware in the Ethiopian context, or Israeli companies selling cybersecurity and censorship tools in the Thailand context. And so, to me, that was kind of an important insight that, I think in some ways we've kind of overstated or overcharacterized the nature of what China is doing around the world, and that the nuance when you go to individual countries is really important. And understanding how that dynamic plays out has, I think, important impacts and implications for how policymakers conceive of the nature of the authoritarianism struggle currently taking place. So why don't I end there? I also just want to sort of say that while the theme of the book is somewhat negative or pessimistic in terms of really trying to capture and understand trends that are linked to repression, I do spend in the last chapter a lot of time thinking about strategies for civil society, ways for activists to push back against these techniques, and how adaptive tactics, processes can actually do a lot when it comes to countering the sort of tide of authoritarianism and digital repression that we're seeing. So anyway, I look forward to the discussion, and I'll hand it back over and to our next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a perfect segue to Ron's research. I think you really spotlight with your book and your research the ways that authoritarian governments potentially weaponize and use a lot of these new and emerging technologies. And of course, Ron's book and research are very much focused on how civil society are then responding and the ways that they themselves are taking control of these affordances. So with that, Ron, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you so much, Alexa. Before I continue much further, I should let you know that my internet is unstable. So if I fade in and out, it's because of a new apartment and I haven't yet brought things up to date. It's not you. I want to share my screen and offer some images. If I can, hang on. Can you see the screen? Hang on. Okay, well, let's just continue here like this. I want to, oh, good heavens. This isn't working. All right, I'll do without the images. Just talk. So my take on the history of new technologies, new information and communication technologies and human rights is just that. It comes from an historical overview of the relationship between technology and human rights. But at the same time, it's also ethnographic. I'm trained as an anthropologist, and even when I was in the law faculty at McGill, it was to be this very disturbing sort of person who's an anthropologist and looking at lawyers and thinking about the law as an anthropologist and lawyers as anthropological subjects, and it made things a little bit uncomfortable. But the perspective that I had from doing this was over multiple decades of ethnographic research with rights claimants. This began in the 1980s and has worked all the way through to the present time. And in my work, I divide this post-World War II human rights era, much of which I've witnessed, into three phases. One I refer to as the analog phase, where people are communicating by phone and going to the streets, protesting through their physical presence, protesting through campuses and streets, engaging in the media, the press, as the intermediary between activists and publics. So there's a journalistic filter in this stage that's very important. In the period of netizen activism that I begin in the 1990s, I'm looking at the impact of the internet and of people's ability to network globally. Now, I saw this in the international movement of Indigenous peoples. I was doing field work in Northern Canada, going to annual meetings and irregular meetings, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues over a period of decades, and watched the transition. And what was very important in the 1990s, this optimistic era of human rights and technologies, was the ability of people to connect globally, but in connecting, to curate their collective selves as rights claimants. They could post online. The online space was a bulletin board that went beyond the streets, that could allow people to communicate instantly to a global audience. This had a profound impact on people's ability to navigate new and emerging human rights instruments and institutions, even as they shaped and created them. So there were laws that emerged that in this period that identified Indigenous peoples as rights claimants, as an example. But through the internet, through this new communications technology, people then occupied that legal space. They identified as Indigenous peoples, as persons with disabilities who had common cause, as women who have particular rights. So we've seen that in this period, the multiplication of human rights instruments, some of which happened later. This corresponded with the new technologies. Now, around 2005 to 2008, we have another revolution in information and communications technologies with the hardware, the cell phone, the iPhone, the smartphone, of which we now have billions worldwide, multi-sensor devices that are in situations of violence that have facilitated digital witnessing, of which Alexa Koenig's work is very important. We have the social media platforms with all of their ambiguity, but again, making possibilities for people to link and to communicate instantly. And then we have what Stephen Feldstein has just described to us, this digital arms race between activists and state actors. And in some areas of this digital arms race, the activists do have possibilities for making themselves present, making themselves heard. So the advent of open source investigation is one new feature of this changed human rights era. And it's enabled people to engage in digital witnessing and, in a way, forms of activism, and again, forms of curating and representing the collective self in ways that bring to the forefront people's identities as rights claimants, as victims, as survivors, as subjects of human rights. Now, the contest with the state, we've just heard some very important new powers that states have, and are activists able to address them at every point? I think it's undecided, and I think that what makes it especially undecided is exactly this idea of the public acceptance of state power. A lot of what I've described is publics communicating not just to institutions of rights, but to the publics that are underpinning those rights and giving people recognition and helping them to formulate their identities. This is an ambiguous sort of thing, because with that public participation comes the trap of stereotypes, the trap of certain ideas about how rights might be limited and so on. But people are successfully, I think, successfully navigating those rights and those identities only insofar as publics are ready to uphold them. So what we've seen in terms of the rise of authoritarianism does worry me a great deal, in spite of the sort of more optimistic history that I've depicted, because with the erosion of the public support of a rights-based society, people who are making claims, no matter what the kinds of communicative power they're developing, and no matter what sort of outreach they're engaged in, they're successful in their efforts only insofar as publics are willing to accept and recognize them. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll have a chance to kind of dive in a little bit as to what both of you suggest civil society, everyday individuals can be doing, and what's needed socially as well to, I think, hopefully put a little bit of a thumb on the scale more towards the side of civil society and away from authoritarian regimes. But before we dive deep into that, which I think could be a very big conversation, I'd love to turn to Sushma Raman to talk a little bit about the book she's put together with Bill Schultz about the coming good society, and maybe inject a note of optimism into this rather concerning world in which we find ourselves.
Thank you so much, Alexa, for the invitation. And I just want to do a shout out to Bill, my co-author, who has really been a fearless leader in the human rights movement as the former executive director of Amnesty International and former president of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. So we both met when we were on the judging panel for the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Human Rights for the International Human Rights Award many, many years ago. And we've been in collaboration ever since. And this book really came about because we both felt that the human rights movement is often mired in the here and now, the crisis of today, the actions that need to be taken, whether on the ground or, in Washington or Geneva, or, local capitals around the world. And we need to look to the horizon. And we worked on this together while at the Carr Center. I am the executive director, and Bill has been a senior fellow the last few years since he retired. And our book is really a broad look at the future of human rights, and it touches on technology, but it also touches on several other themes. And we argue that rights are not static, permanent, and perpetual. They don't stay the same from generation to generation. Some rights will evolve and change depending on changing norms and circumstances. Sometimes brand new rights might arise that people might never have contemplated before. And when that happens, rights undergo a revolution. And that premise is not uncontroversial. In fact, many academics, including some here at the university, have said that in the face of assaults on rights, as well as practitioners, in the face of assaults on rights from authoritarians and skeptics, we should really narrow our focus on the most essential rights, such as the right to live free from torture, or we should ground them in something eternal or permanent. And we really argued the opposite. Traditional understandings of rights as indestructible have not dissuaded authoritarians from dismantling rights and attacking rights claimants. And every generation has had to deal with both the expansion of rights to those who have been excluded, as well as the rollback of rights that occur every time somebody's in power and somebody is excluded. And just listening to both of our guest speakers today speak, I'm really reminded of the fact that these technological tools are often used by both authoritarian regimes as well as liberal and illiberal democracies to address issues of really curtail freedoms and rights of different people. So, so I think there's like a very, very clear need for us to not focus on just rollbacks and protections, but really claiming the space to expand the space and to really think more proactively and creatively about the future horizon. So the book touches on a range of topics, one of which touches on the right to privacy, and that is often considered, as a luxury or a privilege, or is sometimes thought of as really something that is not as essential. And we really argue that the right to privacy is really an essential right and is very much connected to the exercise of not just core rights, but also economic rights, for example, right? And so violations of the rights, rights such as the right not to be tortured or disappeared might cost people enormous suffering or even your life. And infringements of privacy might seem more like an inconvenience or insult. But we unpack really how violations to the right to privacy often go hand in hand with violations of bodily integrity and broader political rights. And they're often the canary in the coal mine that signal violation of rights of a more serious nature. Something I also wanted to flag as I heard our panelists speak is really the disproportionate impact of technological surveillance and deployment of these tools of digital repression on marginalized communities, on communities that have been historically excluded, and the need really for the human rights framework in addressing these harms, and also the need for the human rights framework to think more expansively as we look to the future. We cover some very sort of established rights, but then we also consider how we think of the right to health in an era of gene editing. We consider whether a right to live free from corruption should be considered as a right in the future, because it, corruption impacts the ability of the poor to not just access basic public goods and services, but also to lead a life of dignity and opportunity. We draw heavily on the work of Martha Nussbaum and her work on capabilities as we really think about how people can best fulfill their own agency, live lives of dignity and opportunity, and what are the elements that constitute a good society. So the book is less predictive, we say, than provocative. And rather than providing sort of a toolkit or a set of issues that need to be tackled, we identify some issues that we think need to be addressed, but we also welcome our audience and others into conversations with each other and with us to really think about how do human rights organizations and movements think about the future horizon and how best to be prepared to address future challenges, particularly those caused by scientific and technological advancements. So I'll stop there, Alexa, and turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And while we're about to dive into the conversational part of the hour we have together, I just want to welcome all of the guests to please feel free to put chats into or put questions into the chat line or comments that you'd like to make, and we'll try and make sure that we get a chance to address most of them. I have put links to all 3 books in the chat, so you should now have links to the different publishers' websites with the specific book, and hopefully someone from our team, as has just been requested, can put the whole names of the books directly into the chat so that you all have that for the future. As we kick this off, and I want to also invite our panelists to please ask questions of each other as well, so we can really make this more conversational. But I would love to start with hearing from each of you as to, with the empirical research and the theoretical work you've been doing, where do you think we're headed in terms of our future together, through authoritarian governments, through liberal and illiberal democracies? What's the trajectory that we're on? And if it's a negative trajectory, what do we need to do to maybe avoid the future that could be coming and turn us towards a more rights-respecting future going forward? And would like to welcome any of our panelists to tackle any piece of that and kick it off.
I'm happy to get us started. And I think that, we've seen quite a bit of rollbacks over the past year and a half, thanks to the pandemic, where one of my colleagues mentioned that the pandemic is a great unequalizer. So we've seen an impact on economic inequality, often accelerated by technology. We've seen, vaccine inequality. So, we've seen significant divides both in the United States, but also in many other countries, like think of Brazil, with significant social upheaval. And so the question is, in the words of Arundhati Roy, can the pandemic be a portal as we look to the future? And, could we create a tipping point where people really think about how do we re-envision and reimagine more rights-respecting futures? How do we kind of reach out to others to build better societies? And I am cautiously optimistic. I am hopeful that people that perhaps were not necessarily engaged in these conversations might be more open to thinking about, how we go back to not just business as usual, but really thinking of these age-old problems in new ways.
So one of the things that came out in the conversation, I hope you don't mind if I jump in at this point. One of the things that came out in the conversation is the fact that, or the observation that there is almost a global acceptance of the basic principles of human rights, even if human rights aren't even if not everybody's fully aware of what human rights are. They have their own idea of what those rights are. And they have the idea is extremely widespread that people can pursue those rights to better their lives. And it seems to me that there's a global base of that idea from which people striving to implement rights and use new technologies can leverage those technologies and leverage public opinion. States are going through a lot of effort, as Stephen Feldstein's work shows, to undermine that effort, which means that it's very, very important to them, which means in turn that harnessing education and people's ability to communicate globally with one another about their rights and aspirations is a very important way to go. That means like freeing up the global common of social media, of internet representation, and so on.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I would just add, and I appreciate especially Ronald's optimism in terms of how technology can be harnessed in positive directions. I mean, I guess I'm feeling a little gloomy at the moment, and there are two trends that are sort of keeping me up at night. So one of them relates to liberal democracies, the established democracies themselves, where we're seeing pretty systematic ways that democracies are struggling to keep to hold their governance together. And I don't have to look any further than the United States and several other examples where you see populist and liberal forces really tearing apart, oftentimes embedded by social media, although not directly, not only via social media, really trying to, I think, come to consensus over issues that are polarizing the country in pretty fundamental directions. And I'm not sure where the struggle will end up. I really am not. I feel more optimistic today than I did last year under the prior president, but I also know that that could be very fleeting. And so I think we have to be on guard in terms of the state of democracy in places where we shouldn't ordinarily question that. So then that leaves the rest of the world that are not liberal democracies. And there, I am even more pessimistic in the sense that among those countries that are sort of deepened authoritarian states, look at the People's Republic of China, Russia as two good cases in point. I don't see any real daylight and beyond sort of nascent, very small pockets of resistance that the state is crushing in pretty systematic ways. Now, maybe that is, again, a phenomenon that will change. But for now, if one were to say to me, I think China is about to approach a political liberalization moment, or that there is a growing consensus among Chinese citizens that universal principles of human rights ought to be respected, that would be a hard issue for me to agree with. And then I see that trend increasing in other states that normally, like let's take India, that normally are sort of swing states in the sense that there are both illiberal and liberal components at play. More increasingly, we're seeing the illiberal components sort of swamp the more pluralistic, more inclusive ideas behind what makes a democracy or a society cohesive and work. And to that extent, maybe my panelists can offer some more positive viewpoints in the face of these trends. But I find it very difficult at this moment right now to see how we get out of, or at least to see that this won't be a big struggle that we will have to contend with politically for a number of years.
Wonderful. And one question that's come in, and it's a question specific for you, Steve, so I think we can maybe stay on you for just a moment. Do you think there's a China exceptionalism in digital repression? So does the Great Firewall, is it a uniquely powerful source of authoritarianism, or do you think there's something that we're seeing with China that is evocative of other jurisdictions?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't know that I would hesitate to say exceptionalism. I mean, I would say that, and honestly, I think that the technology derives from other policies that the CCP has been able to enact that have allowed it to sort of accomplish the bargain that its leaders seek, which is essentially will provide economic growth. In exchange, you will give up a significant chunk of your rights. Now, I think under Xi Jinping, the current leader, this balance has been upended even further. And so what we're seeing now is, rather than sort of a bureaucratic authoritarian state, we're seeing the rise of a personalist regime that is, I think, upending how politics normally would be run in the country. And so to that end, I do wonder whether China is sort of veering towards an unsustainable pathway that eventually will lead to some self-correction. But right now, I guess, I think it's exceptional in the sense that it is large, it is a challenge to democracy, and it is a value set that other countries are emulating. It is not exceptional in the sense that it is an authoritarian state of which you see many other complementary models existing in the world that are using and borrowing from those similar techniques.
Thank you. And another question that's come in is a request to see if you wouldn't mind, for all three of you, to get as specific as possible and concrete about what could we be doing to create a regulatory human rights framework around the use of artificial intelligence technology. So especially as we're seeing it play out in things like predictive policing, facial recognition, mass data use in healthcare. What would that process look like, or the substance look like? What would you like to see come next? And do you think a regulatory framework has a chance to really have impact?
So I'm happy to go, and what I'm going to say actually is slightly connected but different, which is that I think there are a lot of people out there who are, experts in this space, lawyers, technologists, policymakers. But I would just say that law does not always equate justice. And so, as we approach the work, to really think about this through a lens of justice. So who is most excluded by existing policies and laws, but also historical practices? What are the intended and unintended consequences of the efforts that are underway? How can we learn from our past, whether in one particular country or across countries, to better inform a more just future? And how do we balance this technical know-how in this increasingly technological world with the knowledge and expertise of people with lived experiences whose voices are often silenced or displaced? And when is it our role as people, whether in academia or public policy or government or think tanks, when is it our role to speak up, and when is it to listen and follow?
Great, thank you. Ron or Steve, do you want to say anything about that?
Steve, you want to go? Okay, I'll go. So one of the things that I found that struck me sort of from the outside of all of this, because I'm not a programmer, and I was looking at this, trying to figure out what it's doing in the world as part of a panoramic picture of these technologies and rights. And it struck me that these technologies are profoundly conservative. When you put something in code, it stays there, it gets transmuted in whole cloth to another application. And we're having some difficulty pinning it down, but where it's coming from are the programmers that are working for these enormous and enormously profitable agencies. And nobody has any real insight into not just the code and how that's going in and what it looks like, but the coders. Who are they? There've been some pushback about androcentrism and racism in the coding community in these large corporations. But I think it would be really interesting to put an ethnographer among the coders and to informally see what it is they're saying to each other, and what do they really believe. And if you can get this kind of informal, accidental, serendipitous insight into what they're thinking, you'll get some more insight into what they're coding and what are the values that's going into these very powerful programs like predictive policing and so on. And in predictive policing, that's a very clear example of how a conservative technology can have an impact, because the information about crime-ridden communities gets put into the predictive algorithms that then send more police and so on. And it's a well-documented vicious cycle of AI and machine learning being applied to the detriment of communities that are supposed to be helped.
That's where I think there's a really interesting opportunity to bring together insights from different disciplines. And I think this trend toward multidisciplinarity and trying to break down some of the silos of knowledge and who does what and who can do what becomes really important for if we're going to break the path that we're on or set a new path. I think we're going to have to look at this issue from very different directions or angles than we have previously. And Steve, I think I may have cut you off. Did you want to go ahead and contribute something?
Oh yeah, just a small point. First of all, I think what Ron mentioned sounds like a fascinating next book, or certainly a large research project. So I look forward to seeing the results of that. One other idea I'd add in terms of just kind of the regulatory approach would be to look at it actually from an economic lens and to look at the incentive structure when it comes to different private companies and the motivations they have for why they design algorithms to reflect certain values and priorities in terms of how they're run and what content is amplified. And so, in that sense, there are certain algorithms that have explicitly repressive objectives, but there are others that sort of have, that are more accidental by nature, where the ultimate end goal is revenue generation. And it just so happens that the means towards optimizing revenue runs through disseminating polarizing content. And so in that sense, without actually examining the structure of the models and the platforms that we've set up, as opposed to putting in place regulations that superficially get at information that comes out without touching on the structure, I don't think we're going to get far. So if we can get at that more fundamental question, I think that's where we could potentially make real progress when it comes to the effect of algorithms and amplification.
Great, thank you. And we have another question that if disinformation is a tool of oppressive regimes, can human rights activists counter this with information? Is that a strategy at our disposal? Why or why not?
I have a ready answer to that, if you don't mind.
I thought you might. Great.
Okay. So one of the things that I've been looking at is a very specific example, and that is digital archiving, where, as I mentioned, people who have these smartphones are able to digitally witness what's happening in terms of a human rights violation in real time. Now, there are of course, some safety concerns that people have and concerns about the security of the information. But one successful example of this is Syrian Archive, that was able to collect and gather more real-time, more visual data from the civil war in Syria than actual time during the war itself, in the form of more than 3 million individual video items in their digital archive. And what that does is it provides an overwhelming amount of information to undo state-sanctioned disinformation from Syria and Russia and perhaps some of their other allies. There is, as the Syrian expatriates in Germany who formed Syrian Archive have said, there's no undoing, there's no disinformation that can undo the amount of documented and verified archival material that they have. And this same kind of principle can apply to other conflicts and is being applied to other conflicts successfully by a number of NGOs that are doing this kind of activity.
Great, and I echo Steve that it would be great to see a next book on covering some of this. I've just put a book in the chat also that just came out called Seeing Human Rights, Video Activism as a Proxy Profession, that gets into the role of Amnesty, Syrian Archive, forensic architecture, and others who are considering the potential uses and affordances provided by social media content, et cetera, that might be of interest. I know we are coming up on 5 minutes to the end of this call. Just wanted to give all of you a chance for any final comment or thought that you would like to throw out there, either looking at the future or the present.
Okay, I'm happy to get us started. I think this has been fascinating. I've taken detailed notes and I'm going to definitely check out my co-panelists' books. But one thought I have is, as we look to the past and see what we can learn, many of the atrocities and repressive tactics we're dealing with today have been found in the past, right? So they were then in a pre-sophisticated technology era as well. It's just that now they're amplified, power can be consolidated, disinformation can be spread very quickly. So yes, I think it's really important to think about these frameworks and best practices and tools and strategies in this digital era. But I think we also have to take a step back and say, how do we think about civic education, for example, in the United States and its role in perhaps dispelling disinformation on issues such as the history of race in America, or, the ways in which different ethnic communities in different countries relate to each other. We should think about issues of solidarity and the role of civil society and how we strengthen civil society at these moments, the role of social movements. So I think we can put pressure on governments. We can think about how to hold technology companies accountable and the best practices in creating sort of global frames for cooperation and action, but then also think about sort of the underlying principles, values, and the ethics that would underpin the way we work together and live together.
Great, thank you. Ron or Steve, any final comments?
Sure. Alexa, you referred to the importance of interdisciplinary in scholarship. And another thing that I'd like to emphasize is engagement. And not just engagement in the short term, but really like long long-term engagement. One of the things that I tried to do was going all the way back to the communities that I first knew during my doctoral work in Mali in the 1980s, which since became a war zone, which since developed a humanitarian disaster, which is also a subject of 2 trials at the International Criminal Court, and so on and so forth. And my more recent efforts to engage with this community has involved digital outreach, has involved using social media, and involved in communicating the tools that they have to be witness to some of their claims, their justice claims and causes. I think this is an important role for people who are doing scholarship in this area, not to be afraid to reach out. I was surprised by how welcoming and curious people were in relation to some of the issues that we're talking about.
Great, thank you. And Steve, any final comment?
Yeah, I think, a few things. I mean, first, I would say that I think sometimes we think about digital technology issues as sort of bifurcated between what is happening outside of democracies, how it's being imposed in certain contexts as separate from what's occurring within our own societies domestically. And I think that this artificial separation it doesn't do us any benefits. That when it comes to combating the spread of these tools, how they're used in illiberal ways, the violation of human rights, that we have to look as much internally as we do externally, and that there can be a virtuous effect when it comes to putting in place appropriate regulations, ideas, consensus at home that can then resonate out abroad. Conversely, we see how damaging the effect can be when different ideas, whether it's the spread of fake news, statutes and decrees, the rising tide of disinformation propagated by conservative extremist groups, and so on and so forth, how much that then gets taken up, adopted, and innovated around the world. So I think one important insight is we need to kind of unify and think about this as a comprehensive whole, not within separate chunks. I think a second thing is that digital repression isn't a one-way street. That at different moments it's cyclical, that states may have the upper hand in certain contexts. Other moments it looks like citizen movements and democratic movements are able to overcome the repressive power of the state. And I don't know that there's going to be an end conclusion to either story or either narrative. I think we're going to constantly see a cat and mouse struggle when it comes to new modes of communication, new ways to organize, and new ways to suppress. And so we have to continue sort of watching that, doing what we can to empower and work with those who are fighting for human rights. And many of the tactics that the Berkeley Human Rights Center, among other organizations, when it comes to open source investigations, when it comes to setting a digital forensic record linked to atrocities, I mean, that's the work that will make a difference. And so, I actually think I cited some of the work that Alexa, your group outfit has done directly in the book. And I think that for me is part of the solution to how we get kind of past some of these issues.
Thank you all. There's one last question that maybe I'll just use because I think it ties up so beautifully, Steve, what you were just talking about, where there was a question about having trouble to understand the role and place of technologies in human rights when I look specifically at the Uyghur case. And I think that's such a perfect concrete example of where governments use digital technologies to identify individuals, to capture them, to fulfill and advance their own political agendas. And yet at the same time, I'm also sending around a link to a piece that some members of our team worked on in partnership with the New York Times to look at to use these digital technologies and other digital technologies to identify what was actually happening with Uyghur populations in China, given that you don't have boots on the ground opportunities that we might have had at one point, but that are now foreclosed. And I think the more that the more the entire world has been privy to a global pandemic, the more that some of these new technologies for human rights researchers and others have kind of gone from a nice to have to a need to have. And it's really incumbent on all of us and the next generation of researchers, scientists, and others to work together to figure out how we ultimately tip this balance. So with that, I know we've come to time. I want to give a big thank you to Alexi Berlin, to Andrea Lampros for organizing this conversation, to our 3 authors and researchers for the incredible work that they're doing and the important work that they're doing. We have sent around the links to all of their books in case you have not yet had the opportunity to read them. If you would like to know about, we'll also send around a link to this video. We will post it to our website in our next newsletter. For those of you who would like to know about other opportunities to engage on some of these topics, you can join us at humanrights.berkeley.edu. So with that, thank you so much. I look forward to speaking with all 3 of you again, hopefully soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.